Welcome to Keynotes from Cornell University. I'm Nicholas Phillips, and thank you so much for joining us today. On today's episode, we're discussing team problem solving and how understanding different problem solver profiles can help us make better decisions more efficiently and quickly. I'm joined by Cheryl Strauss Einhorn, who's the faculty author of our online Complex Decision-Making Certificate program here at Cornell, and who happens to be one of my favorite guests of all time. Cheryl, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm so excited to be here with you. Thank you.
I know, it's so great to have you in studio. It's amazing. So I really want to kind of baseline our conversation today. So you've written several books about decision making. So how did you end up talking about team building and getting into this concept of team building?
So one of the things that I realized is that for too long, we have been told that decision-making is a solo activity. And that really does us a disservice because as human beings, we're always working with other people. And our decisions at some point always have other stakeholders involved. And so what you really need to know is how to work well with other people. Because if you can't work well with other people, you can't solve any of the world's problems. And so in thinking about the research for my new book, Problem Solver, I really thought that if we could introduce the 5 different ways that people make decisions and give them each fun names, because we think in language, so lexicon becomes very beneficial, then we really have a way that we can build trust and strengthen relationships so that we can make decisions well together.
And you had touched on your book a little bit, and I know we did a keynote way back then, it seems like. But can you go into just very briefly some of the 5 different problem solver profiles?
Absolutely. So the research really gets at the psychology of decision making and identifies that there are these 5 dominant ways that people approach their decisions. And as I mentioned, I gave them fun names. So they are the adventurer, the detective, the listener, the thinker, and the visionary. And each of these problem solver profiles has some beautiful strengths. And each of them also has some key cognitive biases that are blind spots that can impede clear thinking. And so the adventurer is an optimistic, confident decision maker. She's somebody who favors forward momentum. And so the ability to actually move forward is very important to her as an underlying value in her decision making. And so a cognitive bias associated with that might be optimism bias. She knows that if she makes a decision and it goes awry, guess what? She has the next decision ahead. And so that's a beautiful kind of decision maker to be because it does have this underlying optimism that she can constantly course correct. And that makes her relatively courageous and able to move relatively quickly. The detective, I'm a detective, is slower than an adventurer, and she really favors having evidence to support her decisions, and a cognitive bias associated with that might be confirmation bias. And the downside of confirmation bias is looking for evidence to confirm a favored hypothesis, which is not as good as looking for disconfirming evidence, which can really help you strength test what you think that you know before you move forward. The listener is a collaborative, cooperative decision maker. She generally has a trusted group of advisors. And so a cognitive bias for her could be the liking bias. She might tend to overweight information that comes from somebody that she cares about or who she has affinity for. The thinker is our slowest decision maker because the thinker really spends a lot of time in problem solving as opposed to decision making. The thinker wants to understand his or her options, and there's a certain loss aversion associated with the thinker because they would rather mitigate the downside than either solve for the best outcome possible or the best possible outcome. And then our 5th problem solver profile is the visionary, and this is somebody who's great at beginnings. They have big ideas. They see the rainbows before we do. And so an underlying cognitive bias for them might be the scarcity bias, where they tend to overweight something that is original or rare. And at times a workaday or a more ordinary solution would be just fine for them.
What's your approach to addressing the relationships when making a decision? So obviously we have different problem solver profiles. What does that look like when we have different problem solver profiles, but we want to keep that relationship intact?
First of all, intellectual diversity is not something we can see, and it's not something that we can hear by how somebody speaks with an accent, for example. And so recognizing that different people make decisions differently is something that we get really only over time, and we don't know what to do with it. But each of the problem solver profiles are optimizing for different things in their decisions. And so it is really a more fulsome understanding of any problem that we're solving if we can embrace and appreciate that these different approaches bring to the table different ways to think through a problem. By knowing these different profiles, you can solve for a lot of the biggest challenges that come up when a team makes decisions. So some of those big challenges are things like lack of clarity, trust issues, personality conflicts, withholding information, internal competition, excessive staff numbers, uneven distribution of work. All of these problems show up when we're in a team environment. And by knowing the different problem solver profiles, it gives you entry points on how to handle some of these complexities in a way that can actually strengthen the relationships as you make decisions together.
That's interesting. And I'd be curious to know if there are natural complements between profiles that tend to synergize especially well with each other when it comes to solving problems as a group. So do certain problem solver profiles tend to work together?
So the first thing I would say is the more problem solver profiles you have that are homogeneous, the more you accelerate the underlying biases that are together. So if you have a whole group of visionaries, you could have people who are great at ideation, really creative, but they may not be the people that actually know the step-by-step logical progression to actually complete a project, right? So when you can put different groups of people together from different problem solver profiles, you actually can balance out and mitigate some of the blind spots more easily and also help to support the strengths. So while they all can work well together, if you have, for instance, an adventurer and a thinker, now you've got somebody who's very optimistic and can move forward very quickly with somebody who's at a totally different speed. They really want to understand the options, and they can end up in a relativity bias where they end up sort of confining the way that they think about the problem because they are looking at one option against the other. While that can seem difficult, it can be so complementary because the adventurer can help the thinker to sort of identify the momentum and to move a little faster. And at the same time, the thinker can slow down the adventurer to think about the why and the consequences. If you have, for instance, another combination of, let's say, a thinker and a detective, now you have two groups that both require a certain amount of data and information to make a decision. When you've got groups that stay more in problem solving as opposed to decision making, there are all sorts of things that you can do to try to keep the trains running on time. You could set a limit on how much information you're going to collect, or you can more clearly define the kinds of information that you might want to put together before making a decision. And you can always set a time limit as well for when you're going to decide.
And how can the different profiles maybe complement each other? So I'm thinking maybe a thinker, for example, or a visionary might be have a bunch of different ways, where somebody who wants to gather the data might have a different approach. How can the different profiles complement each other to come to a decision?
So because they're each optimizing for different things, forward momentum from the adventurer, data for the detective, involving other people for the listener, understanding the why for the thinker, and coming up with things that are original, may not have been thought about, you can see how they each can complement each other. So it's actually knowing all 5 problem solver profiles that you can learn to appreciate what they bring in, and that it's different from how you look at things. And I think what this does is it no longer makes us feel like our way is better. because each of them have beautiful strengths. You no longer have to think of somebody as hasty. You can appreciate that the adventurer is actually able to move quickly and that they don't get anchored in an idea, meaning that they can get on board with lots of ideas, but they can process that information quickly to help people move ahead. And so all of them can work well together.
And just to take a quick step back, what are some of the main challenges that teams face when trying to make a decision?
So we talked about, for instance, lack of clarity is a very big one when it comes to team decision making. And that's really about being stuck in your own perspective and your own point of view, right? And also the fact that we understand words differently from one another. So if I say to you, we're going to be working on sustainability, for instance, that's a term that different people understand differently. So a tool for that is not only understanding the 5 problem solver profiles, but using something like, from the area method, a vision of success. And this is a tool where you are basically asking, what has to happen in the outcome of our decision for us to know that the decision has been a success? And using an alignment tool like that can help you to bridge the lack of clarity problem that tends to hamper teamwork, as one example.
And when working as a group to, ultimately solve a problem and come to a decision, do you think it's better to reinforce your natural problem-solving profile strengths or build on your weaknesses when trying to argue your point?
Oh, when trying to argue your point, that's interesting. I would think that understanding that your vantage point may be and is likely different from somebody else's can enable you to explain where you're coming from. I really favor looking at the data in this situation. This is what I think it's telling me. And then you can ask the person, what is it that you are really grabbing onto that is guiding the way that you're thinking about the decision that we have? If you can't ask them to take the problem solver profile, asking them directly about what are you favoring in your decision making can give you a clue as to which of the 5 problem solver profiles they are. Now you can actually speak to their value structure. I see that it's very important to you as a listener that we have everybody included in this. And by speaking directly to that, they also will feel heard, and that can help you accelerate trust.
So do certain profiles tend to come into conflict with each other initially when trying to solve a problem? So somebody who's a thinker versus a visionary, or a detective versus an adventurer, do some profiles just naturally come into conflict initially when making a decision?
I do think that the different level of speed and information need to make a decision. If you don't know the problem solver profiles, you can see why that can create a lot of friction. Right? We had talked about before the adventurer and the thinker, right? Because they're optimizing for very different things and their ability to move forward is very different. The adventurer does not need all the information. She does not need to know that the options have been closely examined because she is going to be able to have an initial inclination that something feels right to her. She has a very strong inner voice, and so she can move forward in a way that the thinker is not going to be comfortable. But if you understand the problem solver profiles, now you can really appreciate those differences. But that's one example of a type of conflict that could come up, especially in our teamwork when we don't know about the different decision-making profiles. Another one might be the detective and the visionary. This could be a very powerful pairing because the visionary has a good idea or thinks she has a good idea, and the detective knows how to look for the evidence to support it or to basically explain why it's not a good idea. So you can see how they can work very well together. At the same time, the visionary could see the detective, if they don't know the problem solver profiles, as stuck in the mud. What do you mean you need to go and collect all this evidence? Of course, this makes sense. Or why don't we just try it? And the detective might say, okay, I'm happy to try it if we can support it. So you can see how you can help each other work better together as soon as you know the profiles and why there can be real friction if you don't understand the different decision-making approaches.
And does team size make a difference if it's, say, 2 different problem solver profiles versus 10 or 12? Does size make a difference at all?
I don't think that size has to make a difference. Of course, more people means you've got more viewpoints. But again, if you can use a tool for alignment like the vision of success that we spoke about, that can also help you to move much more quickly.
And speaking of team sizes and all that, we just got another great question that was submitted in. So this person asks, if you have a small team of, say, 3 problem solver types, should we recruit new people with other styles to complement the team's strengths?
This is a terrific question. So I would say there's 2 different things you can do. One is once you know the problem solver profile of the team that is assembled, you could certainly look for people who have a different profile to bring them in. But the second thing is the knowledge itself of the different profiles and what they're optimizing for invites you to bring in questions that those perspectives would be representing to help you get a more fulsome understanding of the decisions you're making, no matter what the composition is.
And thank you for that question. That question was great. So, we actually just got another great question in. So Beth submitted a question. So Beth asks, have you tried putting this list in front of a group before starting a session and asking them to self-identify in an effort to drive awareness for different approaches?
You can certainly ask people to self-identify, but you can also go to app.areamethod.com and you and your team or you and your family, you can take the problem solver profile and immediately you will not only self-identify into one of the 5 decision-making archetypes, but then you will be sent just a brief template that will give you the high notes of each of them. And then obviously reading problem solver will give you a big understanding of how to use them. And all of my books have cheetah sheets. So let's spend a minute on this. The cheetah, she's the fastest land animal, accelerates up to 60 miles an hour, but her hunting prowess comes from decelerating up to 9 miles an hour in a single stride. And that's where you build agility, flexibility, and maneuverability. And this really addresses this issue of timing in decision-making, which is why I use this idea of the cheetah because it's memorable. So throughout all of my books, I have cheetah sheets, which give you a list of questions to help to guide you to basically rip the skill right off the page and plug it right into your own life. And in this new book in Problem Solver, in addition to cheetah sheets that you can use as a workbook, I also show you how somebody who I've worked with has filled out the cheetah sheets. So you can see how the logical progression of the questions turns on the aha for you.
Yeah, I remember doing that. It was so much fun. An audience, I would highly recommend doing that. So you mentioned a little bit before about tackling clarity and things like that. So with that, let's just kind of a few of those challenges using the problem solver profile framework. How do we tackle that issue of clarity, for example, when we're thinking about trying to make a major decision?
So clarity, we talked about using vision of success as a tool for alignment, making sure everybody understands the problem the same way, and the success metrics that will guide what people are looking for in the outcome. So let's talk about trust for a moment, because that's a big problem with teams. And so what I would say is that I have come to think of the problem solver profile as a trust accelerator, because I now can understand the underlying value that each problem solver profile is optimizing for. I can speak to that value, and that can make the other problem solver profile feel like they are being heard and can really accelerate the pace of the decision making, because I can come ready for you with the information that you need. So that would be an example of trust. Another one might be lack of communication. And for this, you might have a problem where you are assuming that the other person knows what you know.
Yes.
And that, I think, is a very big issue. So let's just take the listener for that example, right? The listener is somebody who's going to go out and figure out what other people know and what they might want to have happen in the decision. And so you might think that the listener should also be coming forward with his or her viewpoint. And so you could easily have an expectation that they should be communicating more actively, but by understanding that they're going to go collect the wisdom of others first and make sure that they are engaging in a collaborative, cooperative process, you can proactively say to the listener, I want to make sure that your voice is included here. And I know that likely you've taken the pulse of the rest of the team and invite them into the conversation. So you really see that the knowledge of the problem solver profiles gives you an entry point for how to solve some of these team problems.
And it sounds like, understanding the different problem solver profiles can help us not make decisions necessarily very much quicker, but making that decision process easier and understanding like, okay, this is how this person comes to their decision. This is how this person comes to their decision. Is that somewhat accurate?
I think it can increase the pace, but it also reduces the friction. So if you're improving the relationship and you're moving faster, it's like a silver bullet, right? Or a magic bullet, because what you really need when you're working with a team is to be able to strengthen those relationships as you're making decisions, because then you're really unlocking possibility.
And an interesting point you mentioned was this idea of an uneven distribution of work. So say how an adventurer works versus a detective. How do the different problem solver profiles mitigate this problem?
So with an uneven distribution of workload, you can often see this in a team. You might have a senior leadership team, but one person might be responsible for more of the revenue that's generated. And this person may feel, therefore, that when making their decisions, that they're not just deciding for their group, because the way that their group decides on things is also going to impact, for instance, the budget of other parts of that senior leadership team. If you know that person is a thinker, for instance, you might be able to give them support that really feels like support to them. So you may want them to know, for example, that you really appreciate just the thoughtfulness and the thoroughness that they probably have brought to their decisions. Or if that person is a listener, I really appreciated that you took into account how my team felt about this as well. And that can make this idea that there is an uneven distribution of work, and in most team environments, to feel like there is also an ability to strengthen that team because you know how to support these uneven distributions.
And do certain problem solver profiles maybe rely on certain members of the team? So I'm thinking if, say, for example, a boss is an adventurer, do they rely on the thinker, or does that ever come up?
So it absolutely comes up, because now you know how you might want to be balancing out and mitigating for some of the blind spots that you have. So if you're an adventurer, you might really want to bring in a listener who's going to slow you down and let you know what the team thinks. Or if you're a visionary, you might want to make sure that you have a detective on your team who is going to give you the data. I think in hiring, it's very helpful when you are working closely with somebody, if you know your problem solver profile, and then as you're hiring, you can have your candidates take the problem solver profile so you can directly engage with them about their decision making, to think about how you would work as a combination. An adventurer probably doesn't want to hire another adventurer who's going to be working directly with them. At the same time, she may not want to hire a thinker who she may feel like moves too slowly for her. But if that is somebody who is on her senior leadership team, she can also go to the thinker and say, tell me how you're understanding the options. And that can also help the adventurer to check and challenge how she's thinking about moving forward in a situation.
You mentioned before about how our profiles can change over time. How can our different problem solver profiles change based on, what decision we're dealing with at the time?
So that's a good question, too. I talk about in the book Problem Solver this idea that I call situationality. And it's a group of different factors that include your age, your life stage, your level of decision ownership, and the environment that you are in. And so when we are in certain situations, we all of a sudden may make decisions differently. And that can be terrific when you're at home and your mom puts too much chicken on your plate and you don't really want that amount of chicken, and you might normally feel very comfortable with how you make decisions out in the world. But back in the house, you know that to her, maybe food is love, and you want to be able to honor her. And so you show up differently. So at times that can be very good and very appropriate. There may be other times where you say, why did I do that? Why did I behave this way? And beginning to understand how and when your dominant problem solver profile seems to be submerged can help you to think about what is going on in that situation. And am I changing for a reason that I can find some support for, or do I actually want to be able to recognize that I'd like to be making decisions differently in this environment?
And speaking on this subject, I just got another great question that was submitted in by Dr. Rick Watson. So along the lines of changing profiles, and obviously when we're working on teams, that can add another level of stress. Dr. Rick Watson asked, do people switch problem solver profiles, preferred style, at times of stress? So do they change their problem solver profile under stress, especially working in a group setting?
Well, certainly they can, but I would say, and great question, different problem solver profiles feel the stress of their decisions differently. We spoke before about how for the thinker, decisions are very weighty and very precious. And so that is somebody who can feel a high level of stress in their decision making. That same decision for a detective, for an adventurer, for a visionary may not be that stressful because of how they engage with their decisions, because of the time that they need to collect the information that will help them to arrive at a decision. And so it can be experienced very differently by the different problem solver profiles, even if it's the same high stakes decision.
And just as a quick follow-up, how can understanding everyone on the team's different decision-making processes allow for maybe agility, flexibility, maybe even revising the decision?
First of all, if you're understanding what everybody is optimizing for, you can then think about, based on the construction of the team you have, what kind of information do I need to make sure that we've put together and we've talked about in order to make a decision? But I also think there are some very useful tools from the area method that help you strength test your decision. So for something like you're getting ready to make a decision, before you go ahead and begin executing it, doing a pre-mortem, which helps you to think about failure, is something that you can do with your team. And that will not only help you to identify in telling the story before you make the decision of how it might fail, to be able to see where there is weaknesses that you can shore up, but can also give you a way to identify when a decision is going awry and when a decision should be changed or a new decision should be made. So using tools like this can also help you to align around when to revise a decision or when to make a new decision.
And you touched on this a little bit, and I just thought about it when I was reading your Harvard Business Review article, but can our problem solver profiles change based on specific decisions? So I think in the article you had mentioned a company looking to buy a new building. Obviously, you know, some people might react to that one way versus launching a new product, for example. So do our problem solver profiles change when we think about different decisions as a group?
It doesn't necessarily have to change when we think about different decisions. I would say that the pre-meeting can be very different. So if you are an adventurer and your senior leadership team, for example, is primarily a group of listeners and a thinker, you may want to give them questions that they're going to answer before they come to the meeting that help them to have time for their process, so that by the time they get to the meeting, you can actually have a decision-making meeting as opposed to a discussion. If you, as an adventurer, with that same senior leadership team, expect everybody to be able to bat ideas around at the pace of an adventurer, you could see how that adventurer could feel very frustrated. And so in that article, I talk about how by working with this adventurer CEO who had a senior leadership team that was primarily listeners with a thinker, we were able to change the way that she sets up her pre-meeting process with these people so that it can support what they need to make a decision, so that by the time you get to the meeting, you actually can be working faster because everybody has had that opportunity to examine the type of information that they need to help them to engage with, okay, here's what we should do now.
And I just got a great question in from Bianca, and Bianca submitted a question saying, I found that visionaries and adventurers are often the leaders and most powerful people in an organization, and the team assigned to implement an idea are not nearly as adventurous. How do you recommend problem solving when the adventurer or visionary isn't at the table?
So that's a great question. So each of the different problem solver profiles, in part because they're optimizing for different things, have a different relationship to the components of risk, appetite, assessment, and analysis. And often you will have, as that great question posed, an adventurer or visionary at the top, and then you have your listener, thinker, detective that are underneath them. And so in order for them to go and carry out those decisions, they need a certain kind of sign-off from those people in terms of how the decision is going to be executed in different ways. Both the adventurer and the visionary don't necessarily need all the information, but they do need to be kept abreast of how you think you're going to go about it so that they can continually provide the support and the professional development to these other problem solver profiles that need to move with greater support and feedback along the way to know that they're continually moving forward in a way that senior leadership supports.
And how important is it to have that intellectual diversity when we're talking about our leadership team and different problem solver profiles?
I think it's very useful because they are each bringing something different to the table. But you may find, even when you don't have a senior leadership team that has intellectual diversity, that again, you can bring in that diversity of thought by asking questions from the different vantage points and also through a thoughtful hiring of people who have different problem solver profiles.
And are there times when, just no matter how many times and ways you try to approach a problem, a group just can't advance or come to a unanimous decision?
I'm sure that there are times when people can simply get stuck, but in understanding how to talk to each other and how to communicate and how to speak to the different values of the different problem solver profiles, I think you can bring in questions that hopefully can get everybody to be able to think about what would you really need here, right? And using tools like the area method's vision of success, again, can really help you to figure out, where are we going? Why are we making this decision? We're making it because we can see at the end of it in the outcome that this is what it's now going to provide to our organization. And so understanding the different problem solver profiles really helps you build the relationships to have harder conversations and hopefully allow you to decrease friction.
What's your go-to method for solving problems as a group?
So my go-to method is really my area method because it is built on this collaborative backbone and it uniquely is trying to control for and counter these cognitive biases that we have so we can really expand our knowledge while improving our judgment. I want a way to make everybody feel heard and to be included in the conversation so that when the decision is made, we have solved the problem holistically, and that gives it a better chance to succeed.
One last question I wanted to ask, if you could kind of reach out to our audience and give them one piece of advice or one thing to think about, when they're out there making decisions as a group, what's that one thing you would want them to walk away with?
What I want you to walk away with is that there's two kinds of learning. There's knowledge and skill. And I think of decision-making as a skill, which means that you can learn those skills And then you can feel greater confidence and conviction that you can make decisions that work out well for you. And that this idea that we are always making decisions in community, if we can strengthen our relationships as we're solving problems, then we can go on to solve all sorts of problems that face the world. And if we can't get along with each other, we can't solve anything. So I really encourage people, take the problem solver profile, learn a little bit about yourself, and then really engage with the other profiles too, so that you can strengthen your relationships with other people to make big decisions better together.
Awesome. Cheryl, thank you so much. It's so great to have you. Audience, thank you so much for staying with us.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, we'll
and
see
thank
you
you
guys
everybody
soon.
for joining.
If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes as they are released, wherever you listen to podcasts. To learn more about the Problem Solver Profile and how it can help you in the decision-making process as part of a team, check out the episode notes for more information on Professor Strauss Einhorn's Complex Decision-Making Online Certificate Program. Thank you for listening.